So we are starting step 7, which is a fairly easy step, but it introduces an extremely important concept that we'll use many times when creating an application. If statements in HTML, that means we'll be able to conditionally display one part or another. One of the classic examples, which is what I'm suggesting you do in step 7, is to check an amount, to check a value from our BalanceCard component that we've used. If it's greater than a certain amount here, I'm suggesting 1 million we display a different message, okay? I've also used this way of displaying it, which is interesting because in JavaScript, you can write numbers like this to make large numbers, millions, billions, etc., easier to read. It's not mandatory to use this notation. It also works without the underscores, but in any case, it's available to use. If I show it a bit on A, it would make my variable, for example, look like this. Okay, let's proceed and carefully put that information in. We'll use text1 and then text2, for example, as illustrative examples to demonstrate the process, okay? So regarding the syntax, it's going to look like this. This has also changed recently. Before, we used something more like this. That's what I was saying. This was a structural directive that would modify whether the tag it was on was present or not, depending on the condition specified right here. So if the variable was equal to true, it would be displayed. If it was equal to false, it would not be displayed. This still works. You know, we can still use it. And so, for example, here, IntelliJ is going to suggest importing it for me. That too, maybe it's useful to have a few notions about it. There have been several stages in Angular. We had the significant import of the common module, which is a fundamental module that we would typically import into our Angular components that specifically contain ng, which we will thoroughly examine in the very next step, which effectively allows you to repeatedly render blocks of content, ngIf, and which ultimately included a great many things that the Angular development team considered to be quite common, essential things that could be readily included in virtually all components within an application. But then there was some thought given to this. Yes, but we're including a bit too much. So things were broken down even further, down to a very fine level 11, down to ngIf, to the specific directive which reduced the necessary imports a bit, since now we only import exactly what we need in each component. And now we have a new so-called evolution, which is that now it's no longer something you have to import. It's something you can use directly in the HTML, and then the Angular build will do its job and modify this so that it's usable and we no longer even need to import things manually. As for how to use it, this is how it's done. I'll let you try to do this particular step. The primary goal here is to effectively display a clear and concise message. I didn't write it down, but it could be to display a message, "You are rich," if the amount in BalanceCard is greater than 1 million. I'll let you handle that. Let's take a look at step 7 and see what we've done there. The primary goal was to effectively add an if statement based on the specific amount of the BalanceCard, specifically on this particular one, and to subsequently display an alternative message if its value was determined to be greater than 1 million. I'll show it over here instead. It'll be a bit clearer. For the display, it's pretty much what I showed just before. We have an if statement where we set a condition. If the condition is met, we display what's underneath. Otherwise, we display a fairly simple message here. There were several ways to do it. Either we take into account the conversion ratio that we use. So we have to copy the amount, pass it through this conversion pipe to get the converted amount, and check if this is less than 1 million. That will actually depend significantly on the specific functional requirement. So do we want to meticulously check the converted amount or the gross amount, considering all relevant factors and details? In our example here, we have an amount in Bitcoins, and we had an amount in euros. So here I'm using the conversion system. It could be used differently. That's just one way it could be done. Here's a little tip that's not necessarily very well known. Here, if we look, we call the input balance twice to display. We call the pipe twice, and that's it. Which means we end up with a certain amount of redundancy that's not insignificant. In HTML, we have the option to create HTML variables on the fly, like this, especially here, since we can see that this is repeated twice. We can create a variable in the HTML that will be what we had put here in the if, repeated just below, so that we can then use it this way. Now, we use converted, which won't be recalculated because it's a variable with a single value, and as a result, we save a bit of resources. As I mentioned here, this is something we also use quite rarely because, as we'll see with Angular Signal, we can achieve different functionalities, especially those related to signals in Angular, which often means we don't necessarily need this. However, depending on your needs, you might still choose to use it. So that's how you use the if directive. It's pretty straightforward and allows us to achieve this kind of rendering where I interpret the conversion value. I display the value here if it's less than 1 million. Otherwise, I show a message. That's it for step 7. It's quite simple, a rather concise step, and we can move on to step 8.